Our guest today is author Marc Seifer. Marc is an accomplished author and a retired adjunct professor at Roger Williams University, who's written 3 books on the legendary Gilded Age inventor Nikola Tesla. His latest, Tesla, Wizard at War, The Genius, the Particle Beam Weapon, and the Pursuit of Power, is out now and available at bookstores and online. He's also the author of Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, and a book for young adults entitled Nikola Tesla, The Man Who Harnessed Niagara Falls. Marc is also, has also starred in the History Channel miniseries, The Tesla Files, in 2018. He's been featured on American Experience and the BBC for his expertise on Tesla. The Associated Press International for his work on the handwriting of Osama bin Laden. That sounds like a subject of its own at some point. And as a guest of late night radio show Coast to Coast AM. Welcome, Marc. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Bill. It's great to be here.
Appreciate it. We mentioned in your introduction that you've written 3 books on Tesla. What drove you to write this latest book?
Part of it had to do with the television show, The Tesla Files.
Mm-hmm.
I was already working on a sequel to Wizard, Life and Times of Nikola Tesla. And I got called up literally from Hollywood, and they said, you want to fly out to Hollywood and star in a television show on Nikola Tesla and help develop it? And I, of course, said yes. And I had to then come up with ideas for this new show. And the idea behind the show was that after Tesla died, his papers were looked at by a physicist by the name of John G. Trump. I later found out he was actually President Trump's uncle, his father's
Small
brother.
world, right?
Yeah, incredibly small world. But anyhow, the military kept a hold of these papers, military intelligence, for 10 years before they finally turned everything over to Serbia, to his nephew living in Belgrade. And they set up a museum in Serbia. So from about 1943 to about 1952, what was happening to these papers, who had these papers, and were there secret weaponry papers, all of that kind of thing. I had already written about the secret weaponry papers in the first book, but I thought I had to go deeper. And a few things happened which helped this process. One thing which happened was that a lot of the FBI and CIA papers and OSS papers were declassified. So I had redacted papers. I had a lot of stuff with a lot of blackout. All those blackout sections were no longer blacked out, so I could see what they had held back and then try to figure out the reasons why. And another thing I had was someone from the Soviet Union contacted me. He was working on his doctorate. He was American, working on his doctorate there. Sent me declassified documents from the Soviet Union. So those 2 things in particular helped. And then there were other things which occurred. People from all over the world were writing me. And I just continued my research, looking beyond, like, who hired John G. Trump. And turned out it was Vannevar Bush, the head of the Manhattan Project. These kinds of things helped develop this book. So I focused it mainly on Tesla's link to 3 wars, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II.
It's interesting because, I'm straying here a bit, but one of the things I find interesting about Tesla is that from the time he arrived in the US until his passing, even now, he's still relevant. Obviously, the electric car today and all of that, but his influence has stretched through the 20th century, almost into the 21st century. It's pretty amazing the footprint that he left.
Yeah, he kept telling Morgan, who was funding his big wireless system, that, and then he stopped funding and pulled the funding, and Tesla never completed it. And Tesla's pleading with him, saying, I'm 100 years ahead of the other guys.
He really was.
He really was.
You have almost an accidental connections to Tesla, in the sense that, you really didn't think, according to your book, you didn't know anything about Tesla when you went to the University of Chicago for graduate school, but, you ended up learning a lot based on, the connection of the University of Chicago to the World's Fair of 1893. And then later on, once you got into the whole Tesla story, you realized that and this one to me is pretty remarkable. As a youth, you used to swim, near his old house on Long Island Sound. Can you talk a little bit about University of Chicago and how you stumbled across Tesla there, and then also about that little connection there?
Yeah, I did my master's work at the University of Chicago. It was an incredible place. Everybody at the place, like 60 Nobel Prize winners came out of that school. Coming from URI, it was a big step forward. And my dorm was right across the street from the science building from the original Chicago Fair of 1893. It was the only building that was left. And so I knew that the Chicago Fair had been there. But so that was 1972, 73. In 1976 is when I learned about Tesla. And Tesla became world famous because of the Chicago World's Fair. Because in the war of the currents, AC versus DC, Tesla versus Edison, Westinghouse had picked up Tesla's AC invention, and he lit the Chicago Fair of 1893 with the invention. And so he became world famous starting about 1893, because the whole world knew, wow, this is a whole new way to light cities and towns. And it doesn't have coal because it runs on hydroelectric power. It's clean energy. So that's the link I have to the fair. And I love the Chicago Fair, but I recommend everybody talking about the Gilded Age. I know the fair backwards and forwards.
Yeah, it was just an amazing accomplishment. I remember Devil in the White City was that when I read that, I think that was when I first learned about that World Fair, and just all all the structures that went into that were pretty remarkable.
Yeah, one of my classes was up on the Midway. I had it with Dr. Bettelheim, who was a psychoanalyst, and you would walk all the way up. I mean, it was a long walk. And that's where the Ferris wheel was in 1893. So the Midway still exists. And the Statue of the Republic they rebuilt this magnificent statue. So all of that is just a remarkable testament to Tesla and to what the world was like in the 1890s. Talk about the Gilded Age. This was one perfect moment in history, 1893, when the whole world was at peace, and they all came together in Chicago. Hundreds of thousands of people went to the Chicago Fair.
And there were a couple of other sizable buildings there that I don't think they exist anymore, right? There was a building, the main building held thousands of people, right?
Yeah, there was one building that held 80,000 people. The electrical building was gigantic. They were all made to look like they were made out of marble, but in fact they were made, out of a kind of a process that you could dismantle them. In fact, some of them burnt down later, but they have the appearance of marble. And the only one that lasted was made with cement and stone, and that was the science building. It was purposely made to last, but the entire fair was gone about a year after 1893, after it closed.
And then and then as far as the swimming hole story or swimming nearby, I think you discovered that a little bit later, right?
Yeah, this is such an amazing story. I mean, when I wrote the first book, A Wizard, Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, I didn't really know where Tesla lived out on Long Island. Those of you who know Long Island, there's the North Fork and the South Fork. The South Fork of the Hamptons, where all the wealthy people live, and that's where the beaches are on the Atlantic Ocean. The North Fork is on the Sound. And when I was a kid, my dentist every summer, summered on the Sound in Wading River, and they were childhood friends. The two mothers, my mother and his wife, Natalie. And so we would go there for years, for a couple of days every summer, and swim. And there was a big rock in Long Island Sound. I remember my dad and Seymour, the dentist, they got on a tire and they made their way out to this rock. And so you got to jump ahead more than 50 years. I mean, it's unbelievable. Tesla's house was on the Sound, and from that house you can see that rock. And so it was just truly incredible that as a kid I was swimming, in the 1950s within walking distance of where Tesla lived at the turn of the century, which had been 50 years earlier.
One of the things I think was interesting in your book, and we're going to get to the specifics in a minute, but one of the other ties that I think is kind of interesting is that, and you talk about this, your father was a TV repairman. He built TVs, and that he helped you with a couple of pretty, complex projects, building an induction motor, a crystal radio for Boy Scout projects. How much do you think the background that you had in science maybe helped you appreciate Tesla's genius, appreciate what he was trying to accomplish, maybe make a lot of this content more accessible so that you could make it more accessible to the reader?
I think it played a huge role. In particular, my father, he taught radio during World War II.
Sure.
He was in the Navy. And as I was in the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts, and as a project, I decided to build a crystal radio set. He probably gave me the idea. And it had a jar which you wrapped wire around. It had earphones, and it had a crystal and a little detector. And when you wrap the wire around, I used acid to get away some of the coating of it. And the different parts along the dial were the different radio stations. So we set the whole thing up, and I put this giant wire. I lived on the second floor. It was a 2-story house. And we put this big wire out the house and out the window, and it didn't work. My dad is pacing the floor back and forth, and he's going, I don't know. Wait a minute, I got it. He takes another wire and attaches it to the radiator. And he says, this is the ground connection. And now it came in. And I literally listened to the first, Muhammad Ali, who was Cassius Clay at the time, when he fought Sonny Liston. I listened to that on my little crystal radio set. So what I learned from that is that all radio stations are providing enough power that a crystal radio set will pick up the energy. But I also found that the Earth played a huge role in the transmission of electromagnetic, wavelengths. So those two things played a giant role, because Tesla was saying it's much better to send wireless information through the Earth than through the air. And I knew from my own experience that there was a lot of merit to that statement.
One of the things that I think is fascinating about Tesla in general, today the electric car named after him, it keeps him kind of relevant today. People seem to know a lot about Tesla now, or at least know the name. But he drifted into obscurity for a long period of time after his death, maybe even before his death. Why do you think that was?
There were a number of reasons. And even today, a lot of people know the Tesla car, but they don't know it's based on an inventor. They just know the name Tesla. I've met a few people that just don't know that. But it is named after Tesla. And it's because of an article that he wrote in 1904 that an electric motor was a better way to go than a gas guzzling engine. And so we're moving in that direction.
And the original founders of Tesla prior to Elon Musk were the ones who read that article and sort of generated this idea. Is that right?
Exactly. They read the 1904 article. I had it, but I never understood its true ramifications until I spoke to Mark Tampaning, one of the inventors of the actual car. And we have them on the TV show, The Tesla Files. So why his name disappeared? There's a number of reasons. For instance, I know the name Bausch and Lomb, but I don't know who invented contact lenses.
Right.
I know Steve Jobs, and I've had Apple computer since the mid-1990s. I don't know who invented the mouse. So who invented the motor? You knew the Westinghouse motor. So once he sold his patents to Westinghouse, we know the name Westinghouse. We didn't know the name of the inventor behind it, unless there would be some other powerful reason why. In Edison's case, he kept his name attached to all of his products. And it had this fantastic signature, which became his insignia. So the phonograph was an Edison phonograph. But that was one key reason. Another key reason was that he failed in his wireless race against Marconi. Marconi had a much less expensive method for sending messages, but it was highly inferior. Marconi could only transmit dots and dashes, Morse code. Tesla is the inventor of continuous wave frequencies, the ability to transmit voice, information, pictures, and even power. So television is all based on Tesla waves, radio. So Marconi's system could never evolve into the radio. The only way Marconi's system could evolve into the radio is if he adapted Tesla's inventions, and which he did over time. It took him about 20 years. The Titanic, which was 1912, they were still, it sank. They were still using Morse code. So had Tesla succeeded in 1901, we would have had radio and cell phone technology at the turn of the century, rather than slowly over time of the next 20 to 50 years.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. It's pretty remarkable. He was also experimenting with robotics and remote control boats, and at the end of the at the turn of the 20th century, so far advanced in so many things that today are still being used and still being perfected. But for all of that, it struck me, and I think you would agree with this, he was almost the quintessential Gilded Age man. The Gilded Age was such a time for, inventions and different things that propelled us from an agrarian society into the 20th century. And he was almost that guy. He was that quintessential with all the ideas and all the different things that he was working on. He was a real force. Can you talk a little bit about his relationship with so many prominent Gilded Age figures?
Yeah, the truth is, that's really what attracted me to Tesla. It wasn't so much his inventions, of course, which are truly incredible, but it was his inventions and where he lived. He lived in the Waldorf Astoria throughout the gay 90s, all throughout the 1890s and the early 1900s. Friends with Mark Twain and Rudyard Kipling, John Jacob Astor, J.P. Morgan, J.P. Morgan's daughter, Anne Morgan, Robert Underwood Johnson, who was the editor of Century Magazine, and Johnson's wife, Katherine Johnson, who they seems to have a vicarious love affair with. Marguerite Merrington, she's a playwright of the day. And many of these people, almost all of them, are world famous. Two of the most famous people in the world at that time were Mark Twain and Rudyard Kipling, and they're two good friends with Tesla. He writes all these great letters. My favorite letter that he writes is when he writes to Katherine Johnson, "What's the matter with ink spiller Kipling? He dared to take me to this raunchy restaurant in Greenwich Village where I was sure to find hair and cockroaches in the soup." I mean, you just have to burst out laughing. He was a hip guy. He was good friends, of course, with Stanford White, who was his architect of McKim, Mead, and White. So what always intrigued me, he had all these great inventions. Suppose you had this great inventor living in the backwoods of Utah, or Montana
Right.
or something. He wasn't. He was at the hub. He was living in the Waldorf Astoria. And it's really one of the reasons for his downfall, because he should have built his wireless system at Niagara Falls. But he didn't want to go all the heck up to Buffalo in the middle of nowhere with those terrible winters. He was living at the Waldorf Astoria, living like a king. So he built the wireless system out on Long Island so he could stay at the Waldorf and live this high life at the peak of the Gilded Age. And so it gave him an incredibly exciting life.
His friendship with Mark Twain was really interesting. I thought the fact that he credited Twain with saving his life.
Yeah. And Tesla had a great sense of humor. And of course, Mark Twain had a great sense of humor. Tesla was dying of either malaria or cholera. He had a few horrible diseases as a kid. And he got one of Twain's books. And he burst out laughing, reading the humor within Twain's books. And later, when he met Mark Twain, he credited him helping him save his life because he changed his psyche, his emotional feelings at the time, because he was so down because he was sick. And the two of them were crying together because it was such a moving moment. But he was good friends. They were both members of the Players Club. They probably played pool together. And
that's a conversation you would love to have been able to sit on, be a fly on the wall for, right? Any conversation between Tesla and Twain.
I'd like to play pool with the two of them.
Well, there you go.
Or billiards,
Yeah.
I like billiards too.
What was his Stanford White, obviously well known here in Newport, architect of Rosecliff, the Newport Casino, in such an important architectural figure. What was Tesla's relationship with Stanford White? How did that come about?
Stanford White was a genius. I have his handwriting. I don't own the actual handwriting. I mean, I have excellent copies of his handwriting. And I'm a handwriting expert. And he has what's called primary thread. He has the handwriting of a genius. I mean, if I never knew who he was and just saw this handwriting, I would know this is a brilliant guy. He designed the towers in Narragansett, the Tennis Hall of Fame. He called it the casino. If you go into the Tennis Hall of Fame, it's a very neat place. It's very
Beautiful.
Art Deco.
Yeah.
He had that kind of head. He designed the Capitol in Providence, which is the third largest unsupported dome in the world, made out of marble. And he designed many churches and many other buildings in New York City. He designed the Players Club. So he designed the powerhouse at Niagara Falls. And Tesla had sold the patents to George Westinghouse. And Tesla spoke at Niagara Falls as the inventor of the hydroelectric power system. Now this, as I mentioned before, is a clean energy, renewable source of power. So it's the concept free energy. You're not paying for the waterfall. The water will always fall. We're not paying to have the waterfall. You pay for the equipment. So it's free energy in the sense that God or Mother Nature has provided us with this source of power. And he called it harnessing the wheelwork of nature. And when he discussed these kinds of things and he's talking to this incredible architect, they became close friends. And Stanford White would have parties up in Madison Square Garden, up in the tower. The tower was 300 feet tall in 1890. It was the tallest building in New York City. And I have a letter, I don't know the letter, but I have a letter, copy of it, where Stanford White says to Tesla, come on up to the tower, we're having a party, and I'd love you to come. So you get all of this. So Tesla hires Stanford White to design his laboratory out on Long Island, near Wading River in Shoreham, Long Island. And he also designed Tesla's wireless tower, which was 187 feet tall, to transmit electrical energy around the Earth.
And that tower, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well, but that tower, sort of one of two situations in his life where it really kind of derailed him. He interacted with so many figures from the Gilded Age, from the time he arrived in 1884, when he went to work for Edison. What was the origin of the arrangement that he had with Edison? How did that come about and what happened there?
Edison was a huge hero for Tesla, and he was working for Edison in Paris in 1882, 1883. And I discovered a trip that Edison took to Paris. It's never been written about before. It's in the first book, Wizard. And he met with Tesla. And Tesla was one of his fix-it guys. He would go all over. He'd go to Berlin. He'd go to St. Petersburg, and wherever Edison had power stations, if there was a screw up, Tesla would fix it. So Tesla couldn't wait to come to New York to work for Edison. At this point, he had learned how to harness alternating current, where the whole world, including Edison, was using direct current. The main difference was that direct current, you could only send electricity about a mile, power dropping off over distance, then only for lighting. Tesla's system, we would come to find you could send energy hundreds of miles, and not just for lighting, but for running factories. So before Tesla, all the main factories were along rivers. After Tesla, you could put a factory in the middle of a forest as long as you got a wire, transmission line to it. So he's working for the Wizard of Menlo Park. He can't wait to work for him. And he says to Edison, I figured out how to harness alternating current. It's a much better way to go. And Edison says, how can you make an electrical current going in two directions at thousands of times a second, go in one direction? I don't want to hear about it. Westinghouse is into that junk. Don't tell me about it. So they got into a fight, and Tesla quit, and he became a ditch digger. And that started the war of the currents. And so they became enemies. Edison was electrocuting cats and dogs, a horse, and even an elephant. And he appeared at the trial of William Kemmler, who was the first man to die in the electric chair. And he said the best way to electrocute somebody is to Westinghouse them with AC current. And Edison appears and uses that term. And Westinghouse got very angry because he was attributing his name to electrocution. So that's why Tesla sends all this electricity through his body. Those famous pictures of Tesla lit like a candle. He's proving that AC can be fine. So they're enemies. But by 1895, Edison realized he's made a huge mistake. Tesla's laboratory burns to the ground, and Edison contacts him and says, why don't you use my lab for a while until you can find another place? So after they were enemies, then they became friends, and they were friends for the rest of their life. But it was kind of a secret friendship. But I have all the letters between them, which I cover in Wizard at War, all the way through their whole life. They maintain a relationship.
It's an interesting relationship because, you know, you could look at Edison and say in some he was an expert at, he was a master of marketing as well, marketing his product, right? With, you know, and being able to sort of demonize the enemy's product at the same time. And yet they still ended up rekindling their friendship. It's an interesting story, an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, Tom Brady and Peyton Manning. You have these two great quarterbacks, and so they're kind of, they don't like each other because they're competing against it, but they also have this love of each other
Sure.
underneath it all. It was
Mutual
that kind of
respect.
thing. Yes, mutual,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But Tesla at times would criticize Edison because Edison didn't really invent the light bulb. He invented the best light bulb. He didn't invent the phonograph. He built the best one. Um, they already had the ability to record sound. Same thing with motion pictures. So Tesla said, I created new principles. I discovered new principles like the rotating magnetic field, whereas he built better mousetraps. So that was one distinction which Tesla tried to make. But Edison was much more successful in terms of in the long run, in terms of getting his products to market. And Tesla, always had his ideas on a much more future thing. And so he wasn't the best with money. It would come in as he shoveled it out the door, out the window, come in the door as he shoveled it out the window.
Yeah.
So it was hard for him to make his ends meet.
I think it was after his fallout with Edison that he really kind of began working with Westinghouse. Obviously, that led to some noteworthy collaborations. You've mentioned already the World's Fair in Chicago, and the first hydroelectric plant in Niagara Falls. What happened to that relationship between Tesla and Westinghouse?
Well, what happened was Westinghouse also was able to use Tesla's inventions to create the electric railroad. So the entire subway system, for instance, in New York, runs on Tesla's system. And Tesla said to Westinghouse, hey, I gave you a motor and a hydroelectric power system. You're now getting, electric railway, which was not part of the deal. Westinghouse essentially said, too bad, buddy. You sold the patents. If I want to use it for electric railroad, I'm going to use it for electric railroad. So they maintained cordial relations, but that was a strain because Tesla felt he should have gotten paid for the extra uses of this. And later, when Tesla ran out of money, when Morgan cut off funding for his wireless operation, he went to Westinghouse, and Westinghouse basically tells him, I'm just a titular head now. I'm just a figurehead here. I don't really run the place anymore. I don't really have the funds to give you. And it's a very sad moment between the two. But on the positive side, Westinghouse fought a tremendous battle against Edison and J.P. Morgan in the Battle of the Currents to win the right to harness Niagara Falls. Had he lost, which was very possible, we might have evolved in a much more inferior fashion.
Yeah, that's an interesting. It seems like that the rift that happened with Westinghouse and the situations that happened with Edison, it almost seems like, fair or not, it almost sums up a lot of Tesla's missteps. He just seemed to for whatever reason, not be able to maintain productive relationships long term. How much I guess you could attribute that to being a genius, right? And looking in different directions, looking ahead. And was that fair to say?
Yes and no. He did have long-term friendships, as I mentioned, with Ann Morgan, J.P. Morgan's daughter, and also J.P. Morgan Jr. They were friends all the way through the 1930s, even after all the animosity between J.P. Morgan Sr. He kind of kept it secret. But I think the biggest problem he ran into, and it seems to be, excuse me, a personality factor of people that some Serbs. And that is, it's an all or nothing mentality. I remember years ago, this was in the 1990s, there was an ice skater who could do a quad. He could, turn around 4 times on the ice. And he tried to do it in the Olympics and he failed. And he didn't even medal. He could have done triple axles, forever and gotten a gold medal. But no, he wanted to do the quad. And that's Tesla. He wanted to launch this huge enterprise with Morgan. And he spent $150,000 of Morgan's money, another $50,000 of his money. This is in 1901. You got to multiply that at least by 10, if not by 30 or 40. We're talking about 15, 20 million, $30 million investment. And he himself put his own $50,000 and he raised additional monies. And he needed another 100,000 or so. To the billionaires he was dealing with, that wasn't a lot of money, but he had to get that money from them. And he ultimately failed. And I felt that he should have, in a sense of a football motif, dropped back and punted. He had a wireless telephone. He could have done just small, experiments to show that he had wireless telephone. But no, he was either going to build this gigantic tower and have worldwide communication system, or he wasn't going to do it at all. There was no part way. And I think that that was a major reason why his name disappeared, because ultimately he was not able to get the final amount of funds that he needed to complete the tower.
Yeah, I think that's that's the undercurrent, no pun intended, of this. I think your books is, when the more you read about Tesla, the more you seem to realize he had grand plans, not take it by steps. It was, we're going to go from point A to point Z, and he was right. Obviously, he could see what others couldn't, but it seemed like that at the end of the day really hampered his ability to sort of get things done that he might have been able to get done otherwise.
Part of his idea was to sell this electric vehicle and steam run turbines to Henry Ford. And he felt that if I could, do that, then maybe I could get the money to resurrect Wardenclyffe, which was his wireless tower. He did invent a tachometer and speedometers, which he sold, and he was very successful in selling those, but it was nowhere near the amounts of money that he needed. And he was back on the rebound. He started working for Telefunken, the German company, in 1914, 1915. Then World War I interrupted that, and the Germans became our enemy. But he had a royalty clause for 2 of the huge wireless towers, one in New Jersey and one on Long Island. And he was making then like 15 grand a piece from each of them. And that's at the beginnings of the wireless age. So as more and more people would use wireless, his revenues would have increased tremendously with those deals. But then the war happened. So that's another reason why he failed. What I'm trying to say is he came darn close to completing his grand scheme, building other inventions and hoping that the money would come in, or cashing in on his wireless patents with Telefunken, the German company. And then the war happened. So there's all these other factors. It's a very complicated and sad story. But I think another thing to keep in mind is Tesla did not commit suicide. His plans were dashed. He lost everything, but he kept going, lived another 50 years or 40 years, and continued to invent. And what I show in Wizard at War is that we have this image of him as this old man in his 80s feeding the pigeons. No one ever heard of him anymore. And what I found, that's not at all what's happening. There's a whole other thing happening. He's negotiating with the very height of power with Franklin Roosevelt's people, with the British Empire, with Winston Churchill's man, and with Stalin, our allies, trying to sell them a particle beam weapon, and even selling it to at least the Soviet Union and perhaps the British Empire as a way to protect us in case the Germans get an atom bomb before we do. So what's so amazing about this is that he's still in the game, and not just with the lower echelons, but with the very peak of power throughout his entire life.
That's you know what, you raise a great point there, because I think that's one thing that gets lost a little bit, is his resilience. I mean, it had to be demoralizing to see all these other people cashing in, and Edison, Westinghouse, all these different people sort of benefiting, not necessarily from his work, but for his work in some places, and he's still sort of struggling for relevancy. The Wardenclyffe tower. That's a story in itself. And yet at the end, he was still, to your point, working on a particle beam weapon, and all these different, never gave up inventing it. There's something to be said for his resilience.
Yeah, the reason why I mentioned suicide was one of his acolytes was Edward Armstrong, who invented AM and FM radio. And I don't know if you guys, if you remember, but I remember when you'd be in the car, if you turn the dial way over, you could get a television station.
Yes.
Sarnoff stole the FM line. And then when we were kids, FM, hardly anybody used FM. It was a minuscule, but now everybody uses FM. It's a much better system.
Sure.
And Armstrong was in this huge battle with Sarnoff, and he lost his entire fortune. And he did jump out an 11-story building and commit suicide. So Sarnoff, the head of NBC, essentially drove Armstrong to his death. And what I'm saying is that Tesla didn't go that route. And everything you're saying is exactly right. He had resilience. And he talks about, when he gets the Edison medal in 1917, about the idea that maybe this is not the end of our life. Maybe there's another, that we metamorphosize into something else, like the concept of life after death, but also that your work lives on after you as well. He had a transcendent view of himself and of the world, and a sense of humor. And I think all that enabled him to continue on. But ultimately, there is a very sad aspect to this story, and that is we could have had wireless communication and cell phone technology in 1901, 1902, instead of slowly over the next 50 years over time. So it's a mixed bag, studying his life that way.
Yeah, and I think that's I wonder what he would think today if he were to come back and see Teslas going by on the highway, and the cell phone and World Wide Web, which was another thing that he was almost flirting with on the edge, and robotics and everything else. He really was. He was a master of a lot of different ideas that are either being executed today or are still being sort of perfected. I'd be curious to see what his thoughts would be if he were to come back today.
One of the things which I think about is the nature of genius. We use the term a lot, but this guy really and truly was a true genius. And I'll give you an example. In 1904, when he's pleading with Morgan to get the money to complete his wireless tower, he writes an article and he says, essentially, once he said, give me the money to complete it. But in the article, he says, once Wardenclyffe is complete, I will now be able to convert the earth into a brain, as it were, which will feel in all its parts. He's talking about what we have now, where you can talk to somebody in Australia or China, or three of them, in Russia, all at the same time in one spot. Who thinks that way, that you could convert the earth into a brain, as it were, which would feel in all its parts? Even today, that's an incredibly amazing concept. And he's talking about that very image in 1904.
Yeah, that's remarkable. It's, again, there's so many times when, and I've got the book here as well, the Tesla, Wizard at War, the genius, the particle beam weapon, and the pursuit of power. Hold it up so we can see it. There's so many times when you are, when you're paging through this book, when you think, wow, what an idea, what a statement. My last question would be, you talk about handwriting and being a handwriting expert. Have you ever analyzed Tesla's handwriting? What's your thoughts about him as a genius? You mentioned Stanford White.
Yeah, Tesla had a superb handwriting. He wrote very rapidly. He was very clear. He had very excellent fine motor control. What I discovered in 1906, when he knows for sure that Wardenclyffe will fail, he writes to Morgan. He says, every night my pillow is bathed in tears, but don't think me a weak man, because I will eventually succeed. Once, I'm going to advance the world a century. Please give me the money to complete this. But in 1906, his handwriting falls apart. His signature falls apart. And slowly in 1907, it's not so good. But in 1908, it's back, and it starts to get back again. So I really see, his the dynamic of his life through his handwriting. And, I look at J.P. Morgan's handwriting as well. But he was an all-around person. I've also looked at his mathematical equations. There's this myth that he didn't understand Maxwell's equations. That's just plain ridiculous. He has equations where he's got, 10 to the 47th power. I mean, he's got these equations where you can't even believe he's calculating the size of the earth, the speed of light, and all these other things. So I would say, based upon his handwriting, I think if I just gave it to another graphologist, they would see immediately this was a remarkable thinker, highly organized, very fine thinking, and well balanced.
It's so fascinating. We could talk for a long time about this, and I'm looking forward to finishing the book and going back and reading, Wizard Life and Times of Nikola Tesla as well. Our guest today, Marc Seifer, his new book, Tesla, Wizard of War, The Genius, the Particle Beam Weapon, and the Pursuit of Power. It's available now in stores and online. And if you've been around Rhode Island, you may have crossed paths with Marc. He did a book signing in Wakefield recently, and last night he was speaking at the Kingston Free Library. Marc, thank you so much for being a guest today. We really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you for having me, Bill. It's great to speak to you, especially this way,
Yeah, we can see each other. Well, thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Okay.